The human body isn't built for spectacle. When it dies in slow, twisted, unnatural ways, the sight and smell become more than most people can bear. Crowds who gathered in medieval squares to watch executions came expecting justice, theater, even entertainment. What they didn't expect was their own stomachs rebelling. Time and again, there are reports of hardened soldiers, priests, and even executioners themselves turning pale, gagging, and retching as they witnessed deaths so cruel that the human mind refused to process them. These weren't just punishments. They were orchestrated horrors, designed with precision to overwhelm the senses, the eyes, the ears, the nose, until even spectators collapsed in disgust. Let me walk you through 6 of those deaths. 6 moments in history when cruelty went so far that the crowd watching could no longer remain just an audience. We begin with a death so infamous it still lingers in European memory. The disembowelment of Hugh Despenser. England had seen plenty of executions before, but nothing like this. Hugh Despenser wasn't just any man. He was the hated favorite of King Edward II, accused of corrupting the throne, pillaging the treasury, and humiliating the nobility. When Queen Isabella and her lover, Roger Mortimer, seized power in 1326, Despenser was dragged before a mob already howling for vengeance. The sentence wasn't execution. It was annihilation. He was stripped naked in front of the crowd, tied between 4 horses, and paraded through the streets. People spat on him, threw dung, and shouted insults. They hated him so much that justice alone wasn't enough. His death had to be a public purge. At the gallows, they didn't hang him. Instead, he was tied upright to a ladder, his entire body exposed. The executioner took a knife and began with castration, slicing away his genitals in one brutal motion and throwing them into the fire. Witnesses reported screams so piercing that some in the crowd staggered back, covering their ears. But the real horror was still to come. The executioner then cut open Despenser's abdomen. His intestines spilled forward, steaming in the cold air. Piece by piece, they were pulled out and tossed into the flames beside him while he remained conscious. His face twisted into something beyond agony, his body writhing against the ropes. Chroniclers say the smell hit the crowd before the sight did, the stench of blood, bile, and half-digested food burning. Men vomited into the dirt. Women fainted. The queen herself looked on without flinching, but even hardened soldiers gagged at the sight of a man's insides reduced to ash while he was still alive to feel it. When Despenser finally collapsed, the executioner carved out his heart and held it aloft. The crowd cheered, but the retching continued. It wasn't just a death. It was a surgical demonstration of hatred, performed until the body became unrecognizable as human. For centuries in China, there existed an execution so gruesome it was known simply as lingqi, or death by 1,000 cuts. Westerners who witnessed it during the late Qing dynasty often said it was the single most horrifying thing they had ever seen. The last recorded execution of its kind happened in 1905, when a criminal named Fu Zhu Li was condemned. The crowd gathered in Beijing, expecting the ritual they had heard about, but few had actually seen. The condemned was bound to a wooden cross. A hush fell as the executioner approached with a razor-sharp knife. Instead of one killing blow, he made the first incision across the chest, shallow but deliberate. Blood welled up, then another cut, parallel, then another. The idea wasn't to kill quickly. It was to slice away flesh in fragments while keeping the man alive as long as possible. The cuts came rhythmically, on the face, the arms, the thighs, small at first, then larger. Strips of muscle were peeled back like ribbons. Fu Zhu screamed until his voice dissolved into a rasp. Some accounts say opium was given beforehand, not to dull the pain, but to ensure he stayed conscious longer. The crowd was silent at first, mesmerized. But as the executioner worked methodically, the horror deepened. Blood mixed with dust on the ground. Steam rose from the body as strips of flesh were displayed before the crowd. People began to stagger. One foreign missionary wrote that the odor of blood and human meat was so thick that men retched where they stood. At the final stage, the executioner cut open the abdomen, pulled out the entrails, and displayed them. The crowd, already pale and sickened, erupted in chaos. People ran, vomiting into the streets. Even soldiers who had seen countless battles covered their mouths in revulsion. Lingqi wasn't just about physical pain. It was about unmaking a human being in front of witnesses so thoroughly that the very act of watching became a torment. Fu Zhuli's body was finally decapitated, but by then the true damage had been done. Those who witnessed it never forgot the sight of flesh reduced to scraps, the air thick with blood and stench. In Tudor England, one execution was so unusual and so vile that even King Henry VIII later admitted it may have gone too far. Richard Roos, a humble cook, was accused of poisoning the household of a bishop. Whether guilty or not, his fate was sealed by royal decree. The punishment chosen was not hanging, not beheading, but boiling alive. At Smithfield in London, a great cauldron was prepared, iron, blackened and filled with water, oil and herbs to mask the stench. Crowds gathered, curious. Few had ever seen such a death. Roos was bound and hoisted on chains above the cauldron. The fire beneath roared and the water bubbled. When he was lowered in, the reaction was instant. His skin blistered on contact. He screamed, thrashing, trying to lift himself out of the liquid that clung to him like glue. The executioners pulled him up, then lowered him again, prolonging the agony. Each immersion stripped away more skin. Cooked muscle peeled from the bone. Witnesses described his flesh falling in gobbets, chunks sloughing off into the boiling water. The smell rolled over the crowd, not just steam, but the odor of cooked human meat. Chronicles say people gagged, covering their noses and mouths, yet unable to look away. Some retched violently, collapsing onto the ground. Women screamed. Children cried. The executioners didn't allow it to end quickly. For nearly 2 hours, Rose was dipped in and out until his body finally broke apart. What was left was not a man, but a mass of floating flesh in a cauldron that now looked like a stew. The crowd staggered home in shock, some vomiting in the streets. The memory of boiling flesh clung to their clothes and hair. Even hardened guards admitted they couldn't eat for days after witnessing it. Boiling was meant to be a deterrent, a warning about poison. Instead, it became a nightmare etched into the minds of all who watched. And disturbingly, there are still 3 more deaths to come, executions so vile that even these horrors pale beside them. In Paris, March 1757, the Place de Grève was packed with thousands of spectators. They came to watch the punishment of Robert François Damiens, the man who had stabbed King Louis XV with a penknife. The wound was minor. The sentence was not. Damiens was to be drawn and quartered, a medieval execution dragged into the Age of Enlightenment, carried out with scientific cruelty. The ritual began with torture. His flesh was torn with red-hot pincers, glowing iron biting into skin. Boiling oil, molten lead, and burning resin were poured into the wounds. The smell of scorched flesh drifted over the square, already making stomachs turn. Then came the main act. Horses were harnessed to each of his limbs, 2 at the arms, 2 at the legs. Whips cracked. The horses strained, but human joints are stubborn. Damien's body stretched grotesquely, his skin whitening, muscles tearing, but refusing to separate. The crowd gasped as he screamed a ragged, endless howl. Executioners struck the horses, urging them harder. His body jolted, bones splintered audibly. The process dragged on for hours. At one point, surgeons had to slice into the tendons at his shoulders and thighs to weaken the joints. Blood sprayed onto the cobblestones. When the horses pulled again, there was a sickening snap. His legs tore away, then his arms. The torso writhed, spurting blood. Witnesses described people fainting, vomiting, and fleeing into alleyways. Hardened Parisians gagged as they saw Damiens reduced to chunks of living meat, still twitching as priests tried to give him last rites. Finally, what was left of his torso was consigned to flames. The official record noted the execution took nearly 4 hours, but what lingered wasn't the timing. It was the collective sickness of a crowd forced to confront anatomy unraveling in real time. Not theater, not justice, just the unmaking of a man in front of an audience. Some deaths blur the line between myth and history, yet their cruelty is too consistent to dismiss. The story of Marsyas, the satyr who challenged Apollo, was well known in ancient Rome. His punishment, to be flayed alive. Whether Marsyas truly lived or not, the Romans reenacted flayings often enough for historians to leave accounts, and those who saw them wrote of revulsion so strong it emptied stomachs. The condemned would be tied upright, arms stretched above the head. A sharp knife, more surgeon's scalpel than butcher's blade, traced the first incision at the belly or back. Skin, the largest organ of the body, was peeled away slowly, one strip at a time. Victims screamed as nerve endings fired like lightning, the sensation not of cutting, but of being burned alive from within. The horror wasn't just pain. It was visibility. As the skin came off, muscle gleamed wet and red beneath torchlight. Blood pooled at the feet. The executioners sometimes began at the face, peeling cheeks from bone, eyelids from sockets, so that the crowd saw not just a man in pain, but a man visibly unmasked, turned into something raw and inhuman. Writers say the smell was unbearable, copper from fresh blood, sourness from exposed fat beginning to rot. Spectators gagged, covering their noses, retching into the dust. Even gladiatorial veterans, men who had seen organs spill in the arena, admitted that flaying was beyond endurance to watch. Whether Marsyas was a myth punished by gods or a criminal punished by men, the spectacle was the same. Flaying wasn't about ending a life. It was about displaying it layer by layer, until death became a mercy, and spectators turned away, nauseous, haunted by the vision of a human body stripped of its disguise. Sometimes, cruelty didn't end with death. Sometimes, the body itself was turned into a weapon against the living. The execution of William Wallace, the Scottish rebel, is remembered for its brutality. But what followed pushed the crowd beyond revulsion. In 1305, Wallace was dragged through London, hanged until nearly dead, then cut down to face further torment. His genitals were hacked off. His belly was slit open, intestines pulled out and burned before his eyes. Finally, his heart was torn from his chest. But the true horror began after his death. His body was dismembered, quartered into pieces, each hacked apart with an axe. The head was tarred and mounted on London Bridge. His limbs were sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Perth, and Stirling as warnings. But the moment of dismemberment was so grotesque that chroniclers wrote of spectators vomiting openly. The smell of opened bowels, the spray of blood, the sight of a man's body hacked into parcels like butchered meat shattered the illusion of noble justice. People stumbled from the square, clutching their mouths, retching into the gutters. It wasn't just violence. It was desecration. To tear a man into fragments and scatter him across the kingdom was to ensure his death would never end. For the crowd in London that day, the lesson of deterrence was lost in the overwhelming stench and sight of dismemberment. Even loyal Englishmen staggered away pale, struggling to hold down their food. Wallace's execution remains infamous, not because it silenced a rebellion, but because it revealed how far a state would go to break not just a man but the crowd that watched him die. Across centuries and continents, these 6 deaths — Despenser, Fu Ju-Li, Ruse, Damiens, Marsyas, Wallace — reveal a truth most histories ignore. Executions weren't just punishments for the condemned. They were punishments for everyone who witnessed them. The bodies on display were reduced to meat, skin, and bone in ways the human mind wasn't designed to process. The smell of burning flesh, the sound of tearing ligaments, the sight of intestines spilling or skin peeling — these overwhelmed the senses until even seasoned warriors gagged. The cruelty was deliberate. By making crowds vomit, authorities proved their point. This is what happens when you defy us. The screaming always stopped eventually. The bodies always collapsed. But for the witnesses, the memories never healed. They carried the nausea home, into their dreams, into their stories. And centuries later, we still recoil, proving that some cruelties echo far longer than the lives they ended.